What's up, guys? Today we're going to be checking out the iPhone 8 Plus in 2022, which is surprisingly still a pretty good device. So what's interesting about this device is this is the last big iPhone, I believe, with a home button. So we do have, like the iPhone SE 2022 that just came out. That is basically the same phone as this. It's just much smaller and has a faster chipset. But Apple hasn't released a big iPhone with a home button yet, or this type of body style yet, which is pretty interesting on its own. But let's go ahead and dive into the 8 Plus and see how is it standing up in 2022. So as far as the design, this is still a pretty nice feeling phone. It's still a premium phone. I think you can kind of see the age of this phone a little bit, of course, especially from the back and especially from the front. But it still looks pretty decent, so it still actually feels really good in the hand. I actually think the iPhones with the curve just feel way better in the hand than the newer iPhone 13s and stuff like that. So they just feel more comfortable in the palm. Like I said, full glass and metal device. It's IP67 dust and water resistant. It's fairly thin as well too, and also it's not really that heavy. It still has a pretty good weight to it as well. So hardware wise, yeah, I can see it design wise, it has aged a little bit, but honestly, the materials and everything, it still feels extremely solid here. So also I wanted to go ahead and mention the price of this phone, because last time we checked this phone out, it was kind of like solid at almost 300 bucks, which was in last year. But now this phone has come down in price almost to 200 bucks. You can see the cheapest going for 223, 228. Not 228, but 238. I would not really buy it for this 274 price point. So if you see this, I wouldn't really, unless you really need the storage. It really depends on you, but also that is, I guess, fair for the 256 gigabyte version. It really just depends on if you need the storage or not. But yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about the display on here. So I actually really like the display on here. It's fine. It's a 5.5 inch display, which is pretty funny because this is a plus size phone with a pretty small display. Hilariously, a plus size phone in 2022 is like 6.8 inches. So I always thought that was funny how big these phones have gotten over time. So it's a 1080p panel, Retina IPS panel, 401 for the PPI here, and of course the screen itself is fine. Does not have a notch or anything like that, which I think is a plus. But of course it has like these chunky bezels and stuff like that. And yeah, so the screen is actually really not that bad. It actually gets fairly bright, and it actually looks pretty good for an IPS panel. Also, the main reason why people buy this phone is for the Touch ID button, which is pretty sweet. It does feel really nice to click. So if you're really anti like the swipe gestures on the new iPhones, you can still use this phone in 2022 if you really hate the swipe gestures. It does feel pretty satisfying to have that physical click on it for sure, because like I said, this is the only iPhone that you can get with a big iPhone with a home button. I really would not buy the 7 Plus because I don't think that phone is going to get iOS 17. I believe this phone is going to get, of course, iOS 16 and 17. I think the 7 series is probably going to get iOS 16 and that's it. So that's why I would say, just for future proof, I would get the 8 Plus if you are thinking about, buying those two phones. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about how is this phone handling the software. So iOS 15, surprisingly, it's still pretty snappy on here. So it does run the latest version of iOS. And then we have the Apple A11 chip on here. So I'll pull up those Geekbench scores. And it's a pretty snappy phone. You can compare those Geekbench scores to other devices. You can see that's actually some pretty respectable scores in 2022. Now, the gaming performance on here is still pretty good. Like I was saying, Subway Surfer, games like that aren't super intensive, they run fine on here. This phone also has the 3 gigs of RAM, and the base storage is 64 gigs. So like I said, if you need that extra storage, just for a little bit more money, you can get the 256 gig version. But for games like PUBG, the last time I was playing games on this phone, it was running fine, so I don't think that has changed at all. I think the graphics settings, you can still play at extreme graphics on low. Yeah, so you can still play at extreme Of course, you won't be able to max the graphics out like the newer phones, of course, but this is still going to do a pretty good job at, being able to game for the casual user. So games like PUBG, Call of Duty Mobile, games like that still run pretty well on this device. It's not like it's lagging or anything like that. These older iPhones, they do have a tendency to kind of heat up if you game for a long period of time. A lot of people won't notice that because they have a case on their phone. But if you use your phone just without a case, you will kind of notice that these phones kind of get hot a little bit after a while, which is something that I definitely was noticing with this device. It's not anything that'll burn you to the touch. It's just, it can get a little bit uncomfortable for long periods of time. Now I want to talk about the vibration motor on this phone and the speakers. So the vibration motor on here feels pretty good. You can definitely feel this phone vibrating, so that's not an issue on here. And the stereo speakers are actually pretty good on here. So you get a pretty respectable amount of bass out of this phone. The top speaker up here is putting in pretty good work, so if you cover it, you still get pretty good audio quality out of this phone. So I think overall the sound on this phone is pretty good still. Alright, so the cameras on the 8 Plus are actually way better than you might think. So of course they're not going to be like, the flagship level, quality cameras that they used to be in the past. But you do have a pretty good shooter on here. So it's a 12 megapixel standard, a 12 megapixel telephoto. It does 2x optical zoom. And then you have a 7 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p. I was pretty impressed with the image quality on here. Dynamic range was not really that bad. You get a good amount of detail with this phone, and also the coloring on here was really not that bad as well too. And I actually prefer the selfies on the older iPhones than the newer ones for some reason. I just think that it just looks better. My skin tones look better as well too. Yeah, so it's just always kind of a weird thing. Now, I think the thing that aged about this phone was that the secondary lens is a telephoto instead of the ultra wide. Which is fine because this does take some pretty good portrait shots as well too. So it gives you that nice blur effect. So it really just comes down to what you like. But overall, in general, this phone actually takes some pretty respectable shots. So I was pretty impressed with it. So it's only when you put this phone in sort of a lower light condition where you kind of lose that detail. White balance will be kind of off. Color won't be that great. But if you're in good lighting, the 8 Plus still takes some pretty good shots. FaceTime still looks good on here as well too. So yeah, I was pretty impressed with. Now, what's really impressive about the iPhone 8 Plus is that even with this phone having around 85% battery health, I'm still able to get almost 8 hours of screen on time, which I think is pretty impressive. And this phone has somewhat of a small battery at 2,691 milliamps. And it also has kind of slow charging at 15 watts. But the battery life is it's really not that bad. So it's nowhere near as bad as the iPhone SE 2020. That phone will get you around 4 hours, 30 minutes of screen on time. This phone, you're almost getting 6 hours. So I was pretty impressed with the battery life on this phone. So that is pretty much it. The iPhone 8 Plus is still a pretty good buy for people who don't want to get a small SE, but you want a bigger screen and stuff like that. It's a pretty good buy. The chip is still pretty strong on here. It runs iOS pretty smoothly. So I have no issues with this phone. So be sure to let me know, what do you guys think? I'll catch you guys in the next one.